This is Luis Fuentemilla from the University of Barcelona, and today I'm going to talk about how to implement representational similarity on EEG data. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about 4 topics. The first one, I'm going to discuss which are the difference between a classification problem and a similarity problem. Then I'm going to describe what a similarity approach is, and then how representational similarity can be implemented on EEG data. Finally, I'm going to briefly introduce a method that implements representational similarity between participants that I hope it is of your interest. Now, one important problem in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience is how we represent elements, categories, or in other words, classes. The way this problem can be addressed is by trying to distinguish whether a set of observations provided by an individual, for example, are distinctive enough to classify accurately them into 2 hypothetical categories. Here in this slide, we may wonder whether a set of observations of any sort, as it could be a neural or behavioral patterns, are distinctive enough to be classified as belonging to a computer or to a doc category. This is indeed a classification problem, as our aim is to quantify the degree to which an element belongs to one category or to the other. Our aim would be therefore to find a set of particular patterns that allows us to distinguish between the 2 categories. This can be expressed as a square matrix in which the accuracy of our prediction would be reflected by higher values at the diagonal rather than in the off-diagonal. For example, this approach allows assessing whether a given new instance, as it could be the case of a robot dog in that slide, is better classified into one or to the other category in the diagonal. Finding higher accuracy values into AA position would indicate that the observed pattern of data from an individual would fit to a general pattern that characterizes better what a computer may be than a dog may be. However, in other cases, we would like to answer to another sort of questions. For example, is this precious, meaning valuable or important and not to be wasted? This question is qualitatively different from is this a dog or is this a computer? To answer to this question, we cannot simply rely on identifying the patterns in the data that are distinct between each class. A classification approach here would simply indicate that C elicits more similar pattern to A than to B. In other words, finding how the representation of a dog differs from a computer or from a robot dog won't speak specifically of how precious that dog is. Being precious may be represented as a combination of multiple factors that are subjected to individual differences and that may be similarly represented in different classes of items. One way to address this problem is by assuming that part of the solution relies on understanding the similarity between the set of items. In the context of the current example, finding that in one participant the patterns of data are more similar between a computer and a real dog than between a computer and a robot dog would allow us to infer that for that participant, these 2 elements are more similar and highly valuable as compared to the other ones. This is still a representational problem, but here what is informative to the problem is to understand how each of the representations are similar or dissimilar between them. Therefore, a way to express this problem would be with a square matrix. In this case, we would speak about a 3x3 matrix. However, as opposed to as in the classification problem, here the diagonal is not interesting for us. What we aim for is to account for the off-diagonal as they express the similarity between each pair of the elements at test. Now, how do we quantify the degree of similarity between elements? Many models assume that similarity between exemplars is related to the Euclidean distance in a given representational space. For example, in the figure, we may observe that computer and a real dog are closer in distance to this representational space than computer to robot dog. In that case, we would infer that the computer and the real dog are more similar than the computer and the robot dog. Whereas in other cases or in other participants, we would find that the computer is closer in distance to the robot dog than to the real dog. And in that case, the opposite conclusion would be taken. Now, the problem is that the use of distance metrics may be complicated when patterns of data are complex, as they are characterized by multiple parameters. This is the case, for example, in brain recordings, where different features such as amplitude, frequency, spatial distribution are characteristic of a pattern of the data. The use of brain recording techniques requires of another way to quantify the similarity between pairs of patterns of complex of data. A useful and most commonly used approach is to calculate the correlation between two patterns. A correlation provides a numerical value of the statistical relation between two variables. The higher the correlation coefficient, the greater the similarity between two given patterns of data. Therefore, this is a very helpful approach as it provides a standardized measure of similarity with a known distribution. In this problem, there are other approaches as well. For instance, the most commonly used ones, as mentioned before, is Pearson's correlation and Spearman correlation, but one may also use Kendall-Stau, cosine similarity, Jaccard similarity, as well as distance-based metrics, such as Euclidean distance or Manhattan distance. The choice of which is the best one to be used in a study would depend on the type of data. Importantly though, the huge benefit of representational similarity is that this provides a format of a data that can be derived from anywhere. And as such, one would also allow, or this approach may allow, to quantify how different theoretical predictions may fit to the real observations. Let's put an example. Now imagine that we are trying to answer to the question, is this precious, related to the three elements. One possible theoretical prediction is that kids would find more closely related or more similar a real dog and a robot dog. Whereas in adults, one may find more similar a computer and a dog than a robot dog. Now, the advantage of the representational similarity is that we can simplify the problem by quantifying to which extent each of these theoretical models fit better to the real data. For example, in that case, we may find that a theoretical prediction of model 1, which relates to the kid, provides a higher correlation value with the real data than the other model, or the other way around. Another great advantage is that by providing a standardized measure of how complex patterns are related to each other or similar to each other, one could also even compare how different species code different categories. In this study, for example, authors showed that neural responses to pictures depicting animate and inanimate objects or elements were coded similarly in humans and monkeys on the basis of direct recordings in inferior temporal cortex. So, to summarize, the advantage of a similarity approach is that it provides a very flexible and very simplified way to compare predictions derived from different techniques. For example, one can even use computational model outputs to see how they fit, for example, to real recordings on brain imaging techniques such as fMRI or EEG, as we're going to talk about later. One could also compare the extent to which monkey neural responses fit to what humans do, as the example I mentioned before, and so forth. Now, how representational similarity analysis is implemented on EEG data. Now, the first thing we should bear in mind is which are the features that will characterize the pattern of data that we would like to use to assess for similarity. In EEG, the features that dominate this pattern is changes in amplitude throughout different electrodes for several time points. So these two features will therefore be the ones that will define a pattern. However, we would like to preserve the temporal resolution, as this is a key feature in EEG versus other neuroimaging approaches. Keep in mind, though, that we could also extract other measures of EEG and can be implemented similarly in a representational similarity analysis, such as frequency, power, or phase information, as well as connectivity patterns. Now, the features that we would like to take for the analysis would be therefore defined by the temporal and spatial features. In that case, I have just plotted here a representation of different electrodes in one vector, and I separated them for different time points. One can choose as they select. Now, once we have the vectors that define the spatial features for different time points, then we should start implementing the approach. I am simplifying this by just putting 3 time points representing the EEG neural responses to a given stimuli for different categories. In that case, category A would be for computers and category B would be for dogs from the same participant. Once we have this set in this manner, then it's quite easy, because the only thing we have to do is to correlate point by point the spatial parameters, or the spatial EEG activity that we collect from each of the different examples. Now, for instance, in that case, in temporal point 1, we would find that neural patterns elicited by a computer and by a dog correlate to 74%, and that could be included in this box in the corresponding similarity matrix. We would do exactly the same for the same time point, but comparing that with another category, say A and C, and we would fill it up in the corresponding box, and then we'll complete for this time point the correlation that remains, which would fit this way. Now, with this, we just found a way to simply look for the off-diagonal boxes that we mentioned before, that are the most relevant aspects, that basically explain how these variables are similar to each other. This can be also depicted in this manner, in a color code mode. As you see, this would be the correlation, or for another example, of one given time point. Now, as you see, like the diagonal doesn't provide information, as each item basically correlates to itself by 1. Now, higher values represent, in this case, more similar patterns, so that the two variables correlate perfectly. Now, a lower value would basically mean that they are anti-correlated, and 0 would mean that the two of them do not correlate at all. Now, once we have constructed the representational similarity for a given time point, then we can just simply select which sort of relation or similarity pattern between elements are we interested in now studying. One way to do that, for instance, would be to start by the relation between A and B. So how patterns of EEG activity elicited at time point 1 relate between a computer and a dog. Now this could be simply plotted or put it in a XY dimension, in which Y would be like the degree of similarity, basically the correlation coefficient, and then on X we would plot that as a function of time. So basically now we have constructed the representational similarity for a given time point, and we will do exactly the same for another time point, say time point 2, and then we could plot like the value that we obtain for the same sort of relation and so forth until we basically finish up. So in here, what is plotted is the distribution over time of how two elements are similar to each other in the context of like EEG neural patterns. Now this can be repeated again with another relation. Let's say, for instance, robot dog and a real dog. And that would basically gives us a temporal evolving representational similarity pattern that allows us to see the extent to which these two, the relation between these given elements differ or not as a function of time. This is the simulated data, and that would basically express that dog and computer show higher similarity values at around 200 milliseconds, whereas dog and robot dog doesn't really show any similar pattern throughout the temporal domain. Now, as I said before, another way to address representational similarity is to quantify how predictive models or theoretical models that maybe infer from your theoretical background or from your questions do also fit to the real data. That could be easily implemented by doing a similar approach that I did before. So in that case, we would have like two theoretical predictions that may account for our data. The one that relates to how the kids may feel that these elements are precious, and how adults may feel how these three elements are precious. Now, a simple way to resolve this problem is to correlate these theoretical prediction, each of them, to each of the time points and each of the representational similarities observed at each time point. Now, by correlating these two elements, we would find a correlation coefficient that would also be expressed here in the time point 0 or time point close to 0. Then we would have another one, and then basically we could observe how this theoretical prediction or theoretical model fit to real data over the course of time. Now, finally, another way to address similarity is to study how two different persons show similar patterns to a given input. This may be of interest, for example, if we try to understand, for example, how two persons share the same sort of like representations when the given input shares some aspects. For example, one may like these sort of like studies have been well characterized now these days by showing that whenever somebody is remembering an event, it's quite similar to how another person is remembering the same event. Or for example, how two individuals are representing, or basically the neural patterns elicited by watching specific items do share some characteristics between people. Now, the way to address this question, so basically how two persons do have or do not have similar patterns to a given input, to a same input, is simply like by changing the way we include the data sets in the analysis. But at the end of the day, the approach is very much similar. Now, imagine here we would have two participants, participant X and participant Y, and the two of them are asked to basically see a computer in the screen and think about or basically refer to how precious this is for them. Now, during this task, the two participants we would collect EEG data, and then we would proceed by simply collecting the vectors of spatial and temporal features that we discussed before. So what we need to do now is we would like to study how a given spatial vector at a specific time point correlates from one participant to the other one. So in the context of this example, we would go for time point 1 for a given participant, participant X, and the same time point for participant Y. That would basically give us a correlation measure that basically expresses how similar or dissimilar these two participants, so the neural patterns elicited by two participants can be similar or not. Now, in that case, as opposed to the previous cases, though, our interest would fit to the diagonal, as the two participants, what we are trying to assess here is how the same element or the same input to the same class is represented between two participants. That's the case between A and A. Now we would do exactly the same for another time point and another time point, right? So that at the end we would have like a diagonal with all the elements, with all the relations between two participants for a given time point, for a given element. And then this can be plotted, the results of this analysis can be plotted over time, as we did before, right, for several times, so that it gives us a temporal evolving index of how the two participants share some neural representations for a given input, in that case, a computer. We could also do the same sort of approach with another type of stimuli, in that case, for instance, when they see a dog. Repeat the analysis, and that could be interesting. For example, this is like a simulated data because it may show that the two participants share or have similar neural patterns elicited by this category that starts a bit earlier compared to the other one. Finally, another way to compare between participants or to assess how two participants share neural representations would be to simply correlate the entire similarity matrix for a given time point. Now that could be done this way, and then we would express this over time domain, and then we would move on, basically providing the correlation coefficient for each time point. And that was it. So these are the references that I used during this video, and thanks for your attention.